On February 4, 1943, a detachment of Soviet Marines landed on the coast near Novorossiysk. They were supposed to serve as a diversionary force, but fate had other plans. A tiny bridgehead, measuring 300 by 200 meters, became the last Soviet line of defense on the Black Sea. For 225 days, the Germans stormed this land, but were unable to drive the defenders into the sea. How did a handful of Marines achieve the unimaginable? What was the price of this victory? The history of Malaya Zemlya is a story about the limits of human endurance and how the impossible becomes possible when you have your homeland behind you. If you are interested in the history of great battles and heroes who changed the course of the war, subscribe to the channel and like this video. And let's discuss in the comments, could Malaya Zemlya have fallen if the main landing in Yuzhnaya Ozerka had been successful? Or was this bridgehead doomed to become a symbol of resilience, regardless of the circumstances? Share your opinion. At the beginning of 1943, the Soviet-German front line in the south stretched from the Sea of Azov through the Caucasus Mountains to the Black Sea coast. The winter of that year brought a long-awaited turning point for the Soviet troops. The encircled army of Paulus was being eliminated near Stalingrad, and a large-scale offensive was unfolding in the North Caucasus. The Red Army finally launched a decisive counter-offensive after months of retreat and defense. The Black Sea coast occupied a special place in the strategic plans of both sides. Novorossiysk, the largest port in the region, had been under German control since September 1942. The city was of colossal importance. Its port could be used to supply the entire enemy group in the Caucasus. The loss of Novorossiysk would mean the collapse of supplies to the troops and an inevitable retreat from the oil-rich Caucasus territories for the German command. The Supreme Command headquarters developed an ambitious plan for an offensive operation, codenamed Mountains and Sea. The first part involved an attack in the Goryachi Kliyuch area with an advance on Krasnodar to cut off the retreat routes of the Wehrmacht's North Caucasus Group. The second part, Operation Sea, was to decide the fate of Novorossiysk through a simultaneous land offensive and amphibious landing. On January 11, 1943, the plan was approved, and its implementation began the very next day. The offensive progressed with varying degrees of success, but by the end of January, Soviet troops had managed to break through the defenses south of Krasnodar and cut off enemy communications. The way to the liberation of the Taman Peninsula was open, but Novorossiysk remained the key to success. The command of the Black Sea group of forces, led by General Petrov, was preparing a particularly complex amphibious operation. Landing troops on enemy-occupied coastline was always a risky undertaking, requiring precise coordination between the Navy, Air Force, and ground forces. The slightest mistake could spell disaster for the Marines, who, once on shore without support, became easy targets for the enemy. The German defense of Novorossiysk looked impressive. The Wehrmacht's 73rd Infantry Division occupied key positions, relying on well-fortified points and using the advantage of the dominant heights. Every section of the coast was covered by machine guns and artillery. The enemy understood the strategic importance of the city and was prepared to repel any attempt at a landing. Intense work was underway at headquarters to finalize the details of the operation. Maps of the coast were studied, intelligence data was analyzed, and training landings were conducted. Commanders rehearsed every element of the upcoming landing with their troops, loading onto ships, moving toward the shore under enemy fire, and quickly disembarking on an unequipped coast. The Marines were preparing for the most difficult test in their combat experience, but even the most thorough preparation could not foresee all the contingencies of war. The weather, sea conditions, enemy actions, all of these could throw a wrench into even the most carefully thought-out plans. The command understood the risks, but there was no alternative. Novorossiysk had to be liberated in order to continue the offensive, and finally drive the enemy out of the Caucasus. What awaited the Soviet paratroopers on that February night? The plan for Operation C called for the simultaneous landing of several landing parties at different points along the Novorossiysk coast. The main strike was to be delivered in the area of Yuzhnaya Ozerka, where the main group of more than 6,000 fighters was to land. This landing group was tasked with breaking through to the city from the south and joining forces with troops advancing overland from Gelendzhik. At the same time, it was planned to land a diversionary force in the area of Stanichka, a small village west of Novorossiysk. This detachment was supposed to create the appearance of a main attack, forcing the enemy to transfer reserves and thereby facilitate the actions of the main forces. The command assigned the diversionary landing force a supporting role, but one that was extremely important for the overall success of the operation. The third landing was planned in Novorossiysk itself, in the port area. This detachment from the 835th Rifle Regiment was to land directly within the city limits and capture key port infrastructure facilities. At the same time, it was assumed that the ground offensive would break through the German defenses, and all three landing groups would join forces, liberating the city in a few days. Virtually all the forces of the Black Sea Fleet capable of participating in the landing operation were involved in the operation. The cruiser Krasny Kavkaz, destroyers, torpedo boats, patrol ships, minesweepers, a total of more than 100 combat ships and auxiliary vessels. The Fleet Command understood the scale of the task and concentrated the maximum available resources to ensure the landing. The Air Force was tasked with suppressing the enemy's coastal defenses and preventing enemy aircraft from approaching the landing sites. But the winter of 1943 was harsh, and weather conditions often prevented the Air Force from operating effectively. Fog, low clouds, storm warnings, all of this complicated preparations and could have disrupted the plan at any moment. Major Tsezar Lvovich Kunikov, an experienced Marine Corps officer, was appointed commander of the diversionary landing force in the Stanichka area. He was to lead a detachment consisting of the 833rd Separate Marine Battalion, the 565th Separate Marine Battalion, and other units. The total number of troops in the detachment was about 275. Preparations were carried out in strict secrecy. The soldiers did not know the exact location and time of the landing until the last moment. Training was conducted on boarding ships in the dark. Rapid landing on an unequipped shore was practiced, and close combat techniques were studied. The Marines understood that an extremely difficult operation lay ahead. On January 30th, the final preparations began in Tsemeskaya Bay. The commanders received detailed maps of the area, studied aerial photographs of the landing site, and received intelligence data on the location of German troops. Each soldier checked his weapons, packed his equipment, and received ammunition. The mood was serious. Everyone understood that there would be nowhere to retreat. When would the operation begin? The night of February 3, 1943, was restless. The sea was rough, and a cold wind drove low clouds over Tsemeskaya Bay. At the agreed time, Major Kunikov's detachment began boarding the landing craft. The soldiers loaded onto 14 torpedo boats and 2 patrol boats, trying to remain completely silent. Every sound in the darkness of the night seemed deafening. At 2 o'clock in the morning, the detachment set out to sea. The boats sailed without lights, navigating by compasses and coastal landmarks. The distance to the landing site was about 25 kilometers by sea. The soldiers stood in tight groups on the decks of small ships, clutching their weapons and equipment. Splashes of cold water washed over the Marines, but no one showed any signs of weakness. At the same time as Kunikov's detachment, other landing groups were moving towards their targets. The main landing force was heading for South Ozerka on larger ships. The group for landing at the port of Novorossiysk was on course. A huge naval operation was unfolding in the darkness of the February night, and the fate of each detachment depended on many factors. At about 4 o'clock in the morning, Kunikov's detachment reached its planned landing area near the village of Stanichka. But here, An unpleasant surprise awaited the commander. The coast turned out to be rocky, with steep cliffs up to 5 meters high, making the landing extremely difficult. Reconnaissance had not revealed this feature of the terrain, and now the Marines had to improvise under enemy fire. Kunikov decided to move south to a small beach near Cape Mishako. This area seemed more suitable for landing, although it was in close proximity to German positions. The boats turned around and headed for the new location. Time was passing, dawn was approaching, and every minute of delay increased the risk of detection by the enemy. At 4:30 a.m., the first boats touched shore at Mishako. The Marines jumped onto the rocks and sand, quickly spread out, and took up defensive positions. The surprise attack was successful. The Germans did not expect a landing at this particular location, but within a few minutes, the silence was shattered by the roar of gunfire. The enemy opened fire with machine guns and mortars. The landing continued under increasing fire. Not all boats were able to get close to the shore, and some soldiers had to jump into the icy water and swim to land. Their wet uniforms hampered their movements, and their weapons had to be checked immediately to ensure they were in working order. But the Marines acted in unison, quickly forming a defensive perimeter. By 6 o'clock in the morning, there were already more than 200 fighters from Kunikov's detachment on the shore. The bridgehead was tiny, about 300 meters wide and 200 meters deep. But it was Soviet land, recaptured from the enemy. The diversionary landing force had completed the first part of its mission. It had landed and secured its position. Now the main task lay ahead: to hold the captured territory at all costs and wait for the main forces to arrive. Would they hold out? Tsezar Lvovich Kunikov was born in 1919 in Rostov-on-Don, into a Jewish family. From his youth, he was distinguished by his determination and attraction to military affairs. After graduating from school, he entered military school, choosing to serve in the Marines. Kunikov quickly rose through the ranks, demonstrating outstanding leadership qualities and the ability to make decisions in difficult situations. By the start of the Great Patriotic War, Major Kunikov already had considerable experience of service. He participated in the defense of Odessa and Sevastopol, where the Marines proved themselves to be an elite strike force. These battles taught Kunikov a lot: how to organize defense in critical conditions, how to maintain the morale of his soldiers, and how to act when facing a numerically superior enemy. Kunikov's unit brought together the best Marines of the Black Sea Fleet. Each of them had undergone rigorous selection and special training. The Marines wore distinctive black uniforms and vests, which made them recognizable and commanded special respect. The Germans called the Soviet Marines Black Death, fearing their resilience and combat skills. The landing force included fighters of different nationalities and ages. There were experienced Red Navy sailors who had seen many battles, and young conscripts for whom the landing at Mishako was their baptism of fire. But they were all united by their dedication to duty and their willingness to fight to the end. Company and platoon commanders knew each of their fighters, understood their strengths, and could entrust them with any task. Immediately after the landing, Kunikov organized a circular defense of the bridgehead. The soldiers dug in quickly, using any unevenness in the terrain to create firing points. Machine gunners took up key positions, ensuring control of the approaches. Sappers began to mine the directions of possible enemy attacks. Every meter of the tiny bridgehead was used as effectively as possible. Major Kunikov understood the criticality of the situation. The detachment was completely isolated, cut off from its troops by the sea and hostile territory. Supplies could only be delivered by sea, under constant enemy fire. Medical assistance to the wounded was limited, and evacuation was difficult. But the commander did not show any alarm, demonstrating confidence and determination to his soldiers. Organizing command and control on the tiny bridgehead required a special approach. Kunikov set up a command post in a natural shelter among the rocks, from where he could observe the entire perimeter of the defense. Communication with the fleet was maintained by radio operators who were on duty around the clock. Every report, every request for fire support or ammunition delivery was transmitted immediately. The commander's personal example inspired the fighters. Kunikov did not hide in the shelter, but constantly moved around the positions, encouraging the Marines, checking their readiness to repel attacks, and personally directing the repulsion of the most dangerous enemy breakthroughs. The fighters always saw their commander in the most dangerous area. Would he be able to hold his men? At dawn on February 4th, the enemy launched organized attacks on the Soviet bridgehead. The German command quickly assessed the threat and transferred units of the 73rd Infantry Division to the landing site. The first attack began around 7 in the morning, when the morning fog had not yet dissipated. The German infantry advanced with mortar support, seeking to drive the paratroopers back into the sea. The Marines met the enemy with heavy fire. Machine gun bursts mowed down the attacking chains, and grenades exploded among the enemy soldiers. The first attack faltered, leaving dozens of dead enemies on the approaches to the bridgehead. But the Germans did not retreat. Half an hour later, a second attack began. Then a third. The enemy threw in more and more forces, trying to overwhelm the Soviet landing force with their numbers. By noon, the number of repelled attacks had exceeded 10. Kunikov's fighters held out with incredible tenacity, repelling one attack after another. Ammunition was being used up at an incredible rate, and the barrels of the machine guns were red-hot. The medics could not keep up with the wounded, whose numbers were growing. But the line of defense did not falter. The enemy used more than just infantry. The Wehrmacht artillery methodically shelled the bridgehead, turning every square meter of land into hell. Mortar shells fell one after another, raising fountains of earth and stones. Shrapnel whistled over the heads of the fighters, forcing them to press themselves to the ground. But as soon as the shelling stopped and the infantry went on the attack, the Marines jumped up and took up firing positions. Around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the Germans launched a particularly powerful attack, using tanks. 2 light tanks moved towards the paratroopers' positions, firing their cannons and machine guns. The infantry followed, using armored vehicles as cover. The situation became critical. The Marines had few anti-tank weapons, and it was impossible to penetrate the armor at a long range. A group of Marines under the command of Senior Sergeant Bochkarev made a bold maneuver. Waiting until the tanks were at minimum range, the soldiers jumped out of their cover with anti-tank grenades and bottles of incendiary mixture. One tank was set on fire, and the second stopped after a grenade hit its observation slit. The attack failed, and the German infantry retreated under deadly fire. By the evening of February 4, the enemy had launched its 18th attack of the day. This was an absolute record for the intensity of fighting, even by the standards of the Great Patriotic War. But this attack was also repelled. With the onset of darkness, the shooting subsided. The Germans withdrew, leaving the battlefield littered with corpses. The first day on Malaya Zemlya was over. The bridgehead had held. But at what cost was this victory achieved? Of the 275 soldiers who had landed, about 50 were killed or wounded. Ammunition was critically low. Communication with the fleet was constantly interrupted due to damage to the radio stations, and there was still a long night ahead. Would the defenders hold out? While Kunikov's detachment fought for every meter of land at Mashako, the fate of the other landing groups was tragic. The main landing force in the South Ozerka area encountered disaster even before reaching the shore. German intelligence had uncovered the preparations for the operation, and the enemy was expecting a landing in this very area. The ships carrying the landing forces came under heavy fire from coastal batteries as soon as they approached the shore. Shells hit the transport ships, causing serious damage. Several ships caught fire and began to sink right off the coast. The soldiers jumped into the icy water, trying to reach land, but many were unable to make it to shore. Those units that managed to land immediately came under heavy enemy fire. The Germans occupied all the high ground and fired on the beach with machine guns and artillery. The Marines tried to gain a foothold, but the lack of cover made them easy targets. By the evening of February 4th, it became clear that the operation in South Ozareka had failed with huge losses. The situation was no better for the troops landing in the port of Novorossiysk. A group from the 835th Rifle Regiment managed to gain a foothold on several piers and in the adjacent neighborhoods. Fierce street fighting ensued. The Germans threw significant forces into eliminating this bridgehead, realizing that the enemy was already in the heart of the city. For several days, Soviet soldiers held individual buildings in the port, repelling continuous attacks. Supplies were delivered only at night and with enormous losses. Every attempt to deliver ammunition or evacuate the wounded turned into a separate combat operation. By February 10, the defenders' forces were exhausted. The last fighters died in an unequal battle, never waiting for help. The offensive from land also did not bring the expected success. General Grechko's 56th Army fought fiercely in the Novorossiysk area, but was unable to break through the German defenses. The enemy had created a deeply echeloned system of fortifications, relying on natural terrain barriers. Every hill and every settlement became a center of resistance. The failure of the main landing was a disaster for the entire Operation C plan. Instead of quickly liberating Novorossiysk, Soviet troops gained only one tiny bridgehead at Maishako. The losses were enormous, several thousand killed and wounded, ships sunk and damaged. The command was faced with a difficult choice: to evacuate Kunikov's detachment or to try to use the bridgehead for further action. The decision was made quickly: to hold the bridgehead at all costs. Despite its microscopic size, it was of strategic importance. From here, it was possible to threaten enemy communications, tie down their forces, and prepare new landing operations. The diversionary landing suddenly became the main one. But did the defenders of Malaya Zemlya themselves understand this? After repelling the first attacks, the difficult work of fortifying the bridgehead began. Every night, boats delivered reinforcements, ammunition, food, and engineering equipment. The enemy did not stop shelling, so unloading took place in the dark, under fire, with huge losses among the crews of the ships and the landing forces themselves. By February 7, there were already about 600 fighters on the bridgehead. Fresh Marine units arrived, strengthening the defense. At the same time, several field guns and mortars were delivered, which significantly increased the firepower of the defenders. The bridgehead gradually turned from a temporary position into a real fortress. The engineering troops worked tirelessly. The soldiers dug trenches and communication passages, built dugouts and shelters, and created a system of firing points. The rocky soil presented a particular challenge. Picks and shovels quickly became blunt against the rock. Explosives had to be used to create deeper shelters. The bridgehead expanded slowly but steadily. At the cost of heavy fighting, Soviet soldiers recaptured meter after meter from the enemy. By mid-February, the bridgehead had reached a size of about 1.5 kilometers across the front and 800 meters deep. It was still a tiny space, but already sufficient to accommodate larger forces. The enemy understood the danger and attacked continuously. German artillery fired around the clock. Thousands of shells and mines rained down on the bridgehead every day. The earth literally shook from the explosions. The trenches were filled in, the dugouts collapsed, and the communication lines were severed. But after each bombardment, the soldiers restored their positions and prepared to repel the next attack. On February 10, Colonel Gorshkov arrived at the bridgehead and was put in charge of overall command of the defense. Kunikov remained commander of his unit and continued to lead the most dangerous section. The command structure was improved, and a unified defense system was created with a clear distribution of responsibilities between units. The most important task was to create underground shelters for command posts, hospitals, and warehouses. Sappers began to cut through the rock to create veritable catacombs. This work continued around the clock, despite the shelling. The underground structures provided the only reliable protection from enemy artillery and aircraft. By the end of February, Malaya Zemlya was a well-organized defensive system. Several lines of trenches covered the bridgehead from land. Minefields hindered the enemy's approach, and firing points created a dense network of mutual support. The command was able to plan not only defense, but also local offensive operations. The bridgehead lived its tense life, preparing for new challenges. What was the enemy preparing? Life on Malaya Zemlya was incredibly difficult. The bridgehead was under constant fire, and not a single square meter was safe. For months, the soldiers did not leave their trenches and dugouts, getting used to the constant roar of explosions and the whistling of shrapnel. Normal sleep became an unattainable luxury. They slept in fits and starts, ready to repel an attack at any moment. Supplies were delivered exclusively by sea, and each boat trip was deadly dangerous. German artillery kept all approaches to the shore under fire. Enemy aircraft patrolled the bay, attacking anything that moved. Many ships were lost before reaching the beachhead. The sailors of the Black Sea Fleet showed remarkable courage, breaking through to Malaya Zemlya time and time again. Food supplies were scarce. Hot meals were not available every day. More often than not, they had to make do with dry rations and cold water. Smoking was strictly regulated. Cigarettes could only be lit in deep shelters so that the flame would not reveal their position to the enemy. Each pack of tobacco was worth its weight in gold. The soldiers found the lack of drinking water particularly difficult to cope with. There was no fresh water on the bridgehead. It was delivered from the mainland in barrels and canisters. In conditions of constant fighting, the norm was only half a liter per person per day. This was barely enough to drink, let alone for hygiene. In the spring, when the rains came, rainwater was collected in any available containers. The medical service worked in inhuman conditions. There were many wounded, and the conditions for treatment were minimal. The hospital was located in underground galleries, where there was a lack of light, fresh air, and medicine. Surgeons operated by the light of kerosene lamps, often without anesthesia. The evacuation of the seriously wounded to the mainland was extremely difficult. The sanitary conditions on the bridgehead constantly threatened epidemics. The inability to wash, change clothes, and unsanitary conditions in the trenches all created ideal conditions for the spread of infections. Medical personnel were constantly fighting pediculosis, stomach disorders, and colds. Preventive measures were carried out regularly, despite the shelling. The morale of the defenders was maintained in various ways. Political workers held talks, read letters from the mainland, and reported on the situation on other fronts. Newspapers and leaflets were delivered to the bridgehead. Sometimes it was possible to organize concert brigades that performed for the soldiers in relatively safe places. The postal service worked intermittently, but letters were the main link to civilian life. The soldiers wrote home on scraps of paper, telling what they could. Censorship deleted military details, but the main thing, the news that a person was alive, reached their relatives. Receiving a letter from home became a real celebration. Despite all the difficulties, discipline on the bridgehead was exemplary. The soldiers understood that the slightest weakness, the slightest relaxation could lead to disaster. Everyone was responsible for their own section. Everyone knew that the lives of their comrades depended on them. The brotherhood born in the trenches of Malaya Zemlya was unbreakable. In the evenings, when the fighting subsided, the defenders of the bridgehead could relax for a short time. Some repaired weapons and equipment, some wrote letters, and some just sat silently, looking at the sea. In those moments, everyone thought about home, family, and peaceful life. But in the morning, it all started again. Shelling, attacks, the struggle for survival. Malaya Zemlya gave no respite. How long would this ordeal last? The engineering skills of the defenders of Malaya Zemlya reached incredible heights. During months of defense on a tiny bridgehead, a unique system of fortifications was created that had no analogues. Sappers showed wonders of ingenuity, turning the rocky shore into an impregnable fortress. Underground galleries stretched for hundreds of meters, creating an entire city beneath the ground. Here were command posts, ammunition depots, hospitals, and living quarters for the soldiers. The tunnels carved into the rock provided reliable protection from any shells and bombs. The ventilation system ensured a supply of fresh air, even to the deepest areas. Special attention was paid to camouflage. The entrances to the underground passages were carefully camouflaged to blend in with the natural folds of the terrain. Firing points were equipped so as to be invisible to the enemy until the moment of opening fire. False positions distracted enemy artillery from the real fortifications. The Germans suffered losses while firing at empty areas. Mine and explosive barriers created multi-level protection. The first line of mines was located on the distant approaches, followed by wire barriers, then a second line of minefields. Sappers constantly improved the system, installing new mines and traps. Each attempt by the German infantry to break through to the trenches cost them dozens of lives. Engineers developed a unique system of trenches with numerous branches and reserve positions. If the enemy broke through in one area, the defenders quickly moved along communication passages to neighboring positions and counterattacked from the flanks. Circular defense allowed them to repel attacks from any direction without regrouping their main forces. Artillery positions were equipped with limited space in mind. The guns were installed in specially cut niches, protected by embankments of stones and earth. After firing, the guns were quickly rolled back into shelters, preventing the enemy from detecting their location. This tactic allowed the artillery to be protected from counter-battery fire. The supply of ammunition required special organization. The warehouses were located in underground storage facilities scattered throughout the bridgehead. Even if the enemy destroyed one warehouse, the others continued to operate. Shells and cartridges were delivered to the firing positions through protected trenches, minimizing losses from shelling. Communication on the bridgehead was maintained by wired and radio means. Telephone lines were laid underground, which protected them from artillery fire. Radio operators worked in specially shielded rooms. Duplication of communication channels ensured that the command could always control the troops, even if individual lines were damaged. By April, Malaya Zemlya had become a model of engineering excellence. Every stone, every trench, every dugout was part of a unified defensive system. The enemy could only see the outer perimeter, unaware of the scale of the underground structures. But soon this system would be put to a terrible test. Would it withstand it? The sky above Malaya Zemlya became the arena of fierce confrontation. The Luftwaffe continuously attacked the bridgehead, seeking to destroy Soviet fortifications with bombing raids. Every day, Junkers 87 dive bombers dropped hundreds of bombs on the tiny territory. The wail of these aircraft's sirens became a constant background noise in the life of the bridgehead. The Soviet Air Force did its best to cover the defenders. Fighters were based at airfields near Gelendzhik and patrolled over Malaya Zemlya, engaging in combat with German aircraft. Pilots made several sorties a day, returning to base with holes in their fuselages and depleted ammunition. Many did not return at all. Anti-aircraft artillery at the bridgehead itself was limited due to space constraints. A few anti-aircraft machine guns and light guns could not reliably cover the entire territory. Anti-aircraft gunners fired at low-flying aircraft, sometimes scoring hits. But the main burden of fighting enemy aircraft fell on Soviet fighters. Massive raids were particularly difficult when dozens of bombers appeared over the bridgehead at the same time. The earth shook from the explosions, and columns of smoke and dust rose hundreds of meters into the air. It seemed that nothing alive could survive in this hell. But when the smoke cleared, Soviet soldiers took up their positions again and opened fire on the advancing enemy infantry. Assault aircraft struck German positions, supporting the defenders of the bridgehead. IL-2 ground attack aircraft attacked enemy batteries, troop concentrations, and communication nodes. These sorties were deadly dangerous. The planes flew low over the ground, becoming targets for anti-aircraft fire. Losses among the attack aircraft were very high. PO-2 night bombers flew in the dark, dropping bombs on German rear areas. These light biplanes, nicknamed sewing machines by the Germans because of the characteristic sound of their engines, prevented the enemy from resting peacefully. Every night, the crews on duty took to the air, despite anti-aircraft fire and searchlights. The air battles over Malaya Zemlya were particularly fierce. German aces shot down Soviet fighters, but they also suffered losses themselves. Young Soviet pilots gained experience in these battles, learning from veterans and adopting tactical techniques. Every enemy aircraft shot down was a small victory. The connection between the Air Force and ground troops was constantly improving. There were air gunners on the bridgehead who radioed the coordinates of targets to the pilots. This interaction increased the effectiveness of the strikes and reduced response time. Attack aircraft could come to the aid of defenders at the most critical moment of battle. The sky became as much a battlefield as the land of Malaya Zemlya. Pilots and anti-aircraft gunners, navigators and mechanics, all contributed to the defense of the bridgehead. Without air superiority, it would have been impossible to hold Malaya Zemlya, and the struggle for that superiority did not stop for a single day. Who would win this battle? On April 17, 1943, the most terrible ordeal began for the defenders of Malaya Zemlya. The German command decided to destroy the bridgehead once and for all. Significant forces were involved in the operation. Several infantry regiments, tanks, artillery, and aviation. The enemy was prepared to throw Soviet paratroopers into the sea at any cost. The assault began with a massive artillery barrage of unprecedented force. Thousands of shells rained down on the defenders' positions in the first 2 hours. The density of fire reached incredible levels, several shells per square meter. The trenches were buried, the dugouts collapsed, and communications were cut off. The ground turned into a mess of stones, metal, and earth. At 8 o'clock in the morning, after the artillery barrage, the German infantry went on the attack, supported by tanks. More than 2,000 Wehrmacht soldiers advanced on the bridgehead from different directions. 8 tanks led the infantry, suppressing firing points. The Germans hoped to break through the defenses with their numbers and drive the defenders off the shore in a few hours. But the Soviet soldiers did not flinch. Jumping out of the buried trenches, the Marines opened fierce fire. Machine gunners mowed down the attacking chains, artillerymen fired directly at the tanks, and anti-tank gunners allowed armored vehicles to approach to a minimum distance. The first wave of the attack was drowned out by a barrage of fire. The Germans did not retreat. The second attack followed immediately, then the third, then the fourth. The enemy continuously threw in fresh forces, giving the defenders no respite. The fighting was for every meter of trench, for every dugout. In some places, the Germans managed to break through the Soviet positions, and hand-to-hand combat ensued. Major Kunikov personally led the counterattack on one of the critical sections. A group of Marines with grenades and machine guns crashed into the entrenched Germans, and in a fierce battle, pushed them back. But in this battle, Kunikov was mortally wounded by a mine fragment. The commander was carried off the battlefield and sent by boat to the mainland, but he could not be saved. The hero of Malaya Zemlya died on the 14th day of March. The fighting on April 17 continued until late in the evening. The Germans launched 11 massive attacks, but none of them were successful. By nightfall, the offensive had run out of steam. The enemy withdrew to their starting positions, leaving hundreds of corpses and several damaged tanks on the approaches to the bridgehead. The defenders of Malaya Zemlya had held out, but victory came at a terrible price. The defenders suffered 300 casualties, including both dead and wounded. Many positions were destroyed and needed to be rebuilt. Ammunition was almost exhausted, but most importantly, Kunikov, the commander who had become a symbol of the resilience of Malaya Zemlya, was killed. He was replaced by Lieutenant Colonel Botilev, who who continued the hero's work. The April battle showed that the Germans would not be able to take the bridgehead by storm. But it also showed something else. Malaya Zemlya could only be held at the cost of constant tension of all forces. There were still months of defense ahead. Would there be enough strength to see it through to the end? The defense of Malaya Zemlya produced a whole galaxy of heroes whose names are forever inscribed in history. Among the defenders of the bridgehead, 21 were awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union, an incredible concentration of heroism in such a small space. Each of these people performed a feat worthy of a separate story. Senior Sergeant Nikolai Filchenkov distinguished himself in the very first days of the defense. During one of the German attacks, he replaced a machine gunner who had been knocked out of action and repelled the attack until his last bullet. When the Germans got close, Filchenkov blew himself up with a grenade, along with the enemies surrounding him, repeating the feat of Alexander Matrosov. Sergeant Mikhail Kornitsky commanded a sapper unit that provided mine and explosive barriers. His group laid hundreds of mines on the approaches to the bridgehead, repeatedly repelling enemy attacks. When the Germans broke through to his position, Kornitsky personally led a counterattack and killed more than 10 enemy soldiers in hand-to-hand combat. Second Lieutenant Tsezar Kunikov was posthumously awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. His name became a symbol of Malaya Zemlya. Streets in Novorossiysk and other cities were named in his honor, and his portrait adorned school history textbooks. The memory of the commander who was the first to set foot on the shore and gave his life for the bridgehead lived on in the hearts of the defenders. During the defense, sniper Pyotr Zelenko killed 111 German soldiers and officers. His position was at the very edge of the bridgehead, from where he had a view of the German trenches. Zelenko chose his targets calmly and acted deliberately. He especially liked to hunt enemy snipers, engaging in deadly duels with them through the sights of their rifles. Military doctor Tatyana Golubyeva saved the lives of hundreds of wounded soldiers. She worked in an underground hospital on the bridgehead, operating 18 hours a day. When the medicines ran out, she used seawater to wash the wounds. When there was no anesthesia, she operated amid the roar of explosions, calming the wounded herself. Her hands worked miracles in inhuman conditions. Political instructor Leonid Malinin supported the morale of the defenders by his personal example. During one of the critical attacks, when the Germans broke through to the command post, he took an automatic rifle and personally led the repulsion of the breakthrough. His speeches to the soldiers instilled confidence even in the most difficult moments. Malinin died a brave death in the July battles. Artilleryman Ivan Kulikov commanded a gun crew that destroyed 7 German tanks. His gun fired directly, allowing the tanks to approach at minimum distance. Every shot was accurate. Every hit was the result of professionalism. When the gun was damaged, Kulikov repaired it right under fire and continued the battle. These are just a few names from among the thousands of defenders of Malaya Zemlya. Every soldier on this bridgehead was a hero, each contributing to the defense. Some received awards and recognition, while others remained unknown. But together, they created the legend of the unconquered bridgehead. Their feat became an example for the whole country. What other trials awaited them? After the failure of the April assault, the Germans changed their tactics. Instead of massive attacks, the enemy switched to methodical shelling of the bridgehead, seeking to wear down the defenders with constant pressure. The Wehrmacht artillery fired around the clock, giving the soldiers no respite. This tactic of attrition lasted for many months. The summer of 1943 brought new difficulties. The heat on the tiny bridgehead became unbearable. The temperature in the trenches and dugouts rose to 40 degrees. The problem of drinking water became even more acute. The soldiers suffered from thirst, heat stroke, and skin diseases. Sanitary conditions deteriorated. But the summer also brought positive changes. The sea calmed down, and supplies became more regular. More ammunition, food, and medicine were delivered to the bridgehead. Fresh units arrived, replacing the battle-weary soldiers. Rotation allowed the garrison's combat capability to be maintained at the proper level. In June, tanks arrived at the bridgehead. These were light T-60 tanks, which were transported on special barges. Delivering armored vehicles to the tiny bridgehead seemed an impossible task. But the sailors and engineers managed it. The tanks were dug into the ground, turning them into stationary firing points, capable of supporting the defense with powerful fire. The Soviet command began planning offensive operations from the bridgehead. Reconnaissance raids were carried out deep into German defenses. Sabotage groups disrupted enemy communications, destroyed warehouses, and set up ambushes. The small piece of land gradually transformed from a defensive position into a bridgehead for a future offensive. August was a month of intense preparation. Additional forces were secretly transferred to the bridgehead. Artillery stockpiled ammunition for the upcoming operation. Sappers created passages through minefields for the attacking troops. Everything was done in strict secrecy, so as not to reveal the plans to the enemy. The enemy also strengthened their defenses around Novorossiysk. The Germans understood that sooner or later there would be an attack from Malaya Zemlya. Additional lines of trenches were created. Minefields were expanded, and artillery positions were improved. The Wehrmacht's 73rd Infantry Division was preparing to repel the offensive. Life on the bridgehead had become somewhat routine. The soldiers had grown accustomed to constant shelling and had learned to identify the type of shell and its point of impact by the sound it made. They developed skills for surviving in extreme conditions. Veterans passed on their experience to newcomers, explaining how to act in different situations. But despite their familiarity with the situation, the tension did not ease. Every night, the Germans carried out reconnaissance sorties, seeking to capture a tongue or destroy a firing point. Every day, the artillery shelled the positions. There were casualties every day. The bridgehead required constant vigilance and readiness to repel attacks. By the beginning of September, there were about 16,000 soldiers on Malaya Zemlya. It was a powerful force, ready to strike. The accumulated supplies allowed for several weeks of active combat operations. The command set the date for the offensive, September 9th. A new chapter in the history of the bridgehead was beginning. Would they be able to break through the enemy's defenses? Early in the morning of September 9th, 1943, the silence was broken by the roar of hundreds of guns. The artillery preparation for the Soviet offensive on Novorossiysk had begun. From Malaya Zemlya and the mainland, a barrage of fire simultaneously rained down on German positions. The operation to liberate the city was codenamed Verny, Faithful. The artillery preparation lasted several hours. Thousands of shells plowed through German trenches, destroyed firing points, and suppressed enemy batteries. The Air Force struck the rear of the Wehrmacht, destroying communication nodes and warehouses. The enemy suffered huge losses even before the infantry attack began. At 10 o'clock in the morning, the infantry went on the offensive. A powerful group of Soviet troops struck from Malaya Zemlya, breaking through the defenses in a narrow section. At the same time, an offensive began from the east, where the troops of the 56th Army delivered the main blow. The Germans found themselves caught in a pincer movement. The fighting raged with incredible intensity. The German defenses, which had taken months to build, were breaking under the onslaught of the Soviet troops. But the enemy resisted desperately, understanding the strategic importance of Novorossiysk. Every hill, every settlement became the scene of fierce battles. Tanks, artillery, aircraft, everything was thrown into the fight. The troops advancing from Malaya Zemlya were the first to break through the outer perimeter of the German defenses. 7 months of sitting on a tiny bridgehead were over. The soldiers advanced enthusiastically, liberating their homeland meter by meter. The village of Maishako, where Kunikov's landing force had once landed, was liberated on the first day of the offensive. On September 11, Soviet troops reached the outskirts of Novorossiysk. Street fighting began. The enemy clung to every building, turning the city into a battlefield. Assault groups of Soviet soldiers cleared block after block, house after house. Sappers cleared the streets of mines, discovering numerous traps and booby traps. On September 13th, the port of Novorossiysk was liberated. Soviet sailors raised the red flag over the port facilities. It was a symbolic moment. The city, which had been in enemy hands for more than a year, was once again Soviet. But the fighting continued. The Germans held the western part of the city and attempted to organize counterattacks. On September 16, 1943, Novorossiysk was completely liberated. The last German units retreated westward to Anapa and Taman. The operation, which began on Malaya Zemlya, ended in complete victory. 7 months of heroic defense of a tiny bridgehead paid off in full. The city was free. Columns of Soviet troops marched through the streets of liberated Novorossiysk. Residents who had survived the occupation greeted their liberators with tears of joy. The city lay in ruins. The Germans had destroyed the port, residential areas, and infrastructure. But the main thing had been accomplished. The enemy had been expelled, and reconstruction could begin. The small land had fulfilled its historic mission. What mark would this bridgehead leave? The liberation of Novorossiysk was a turning point in the battle for the Caucasus. After the loss of the city, the entire German group on the Taman Peninsula found itself in a critical situation. Over the next few weeks, Soviet troops methodically pushed the enemy westward. On October 9, 1943, the Taman Peninsula was completely cleared of German troops. Malaya Zemlya went down in history as one of the most striking examples of the fortitude and heroism of Soviet soldiers. The 225 days of defense of the tiny bridgehead became legendary. It was written about in newspapers, talked about on the radio, and made into documentaries. The defenders of Malaya Zemlya became a symbol of the unyielding spirit of a people capable of withstanding any trial. The statistics of the defense were astonishing. Over 7 months, more than 200,000 tons of cargo were delivered to the bridgehead. About 30,000 soldiers passed through Malaya Zemlya. The enemy lost more than 7,000 soldiers killed and wounded under its walls. Soviet losses were also significant, about 10,000 people. After the war, a memorial complex was created on the site of the bridgehead. A majestic monument in the form of a ship's bow crashing into the ground became a symbol of Malaya Zemlya. The museum houses relics of the defense, weapons, documents, photographs, and personal belongings of the defenders. Every year, thousands of people visit this place to pay tribute to the heroes. In 1973, Novorossiysk was awarded the title of Hero City for its courage and fortitude during the war. Malaya Zemlya was one of the main reasons for this high honor. The defense of the bridgehead was seen as not only a military feat, but also a moral one. Proof that spirit is stronger than matter. Many veterans of Malaya Zemlya returned to Novorossiysk after the war. They participated in the restoration of the city, worked in factories and on construction sites, and taught the younger generation. Every May 9, they gathered at the monument, remembered their fellow soldiers, and shared their memories. Over the years, their numbers dwindled, but the memory remained. The history of Malaya Zemlya became part of military science. The defense of the bridgehead is studied in military academies as an example of the proper organization of defense in conditions of complete isolation. Engineering solutions, tactical techniques, and supply systems have all been included in textbooks and manuals. The experience of the defenders helps to understand the laws of war and the human spirit. The names of the heroes of Malaya Zemlya live on in the memory of the people. Streets and squares are named in their honor. Schools bear their names. Books and films tell their stories. 21 heroes of the Soviet Union and hundreds of recipients of orders and medals are only the visible part of the feat. Thousands of nameless defenders who fell on this piece of land are also worthy of eternal memory. Malaya Zemlya proved that nothing is impossible when defending the motherland. The tiny bridgehead withstood the superior forces of the enemy and became the basis for the liberation of the entire region. 7 months of heroic defense went down in history as an example of what a person is capable of when there is nowhere to retreat and no one to retreat from. The memory of the bridgehead that did not surrender will live forever.